September 2nd, 1959. Seattle, Washington. 62-year-old Pearl Kongsle discovers a paper sack on the walkway outside her residence, and when she bends over to pick it up, a bomb goes off and kills her. Even though a car containing 3 teenage boys is seen speeding away from the scene immediately following the blast, investigators are unable to turn up any major leads or compelling suspects with a motive to harm Pearl. It turns out that months earlier, 2 relatives of Pearl's late husband died after a mysterious poisoning, and sticks of dynamite were discovered on the property of Pearl's brother-in-law, but no link could be found between these incidents, and Pearl's murder remains unsolved. After that, the trail went cold. Hello everyone, and welcome to our latest episode of The Trail Went Cold. I'm your host Robin Werder, and today we're going to be covering a very bizarre story about an elderly woman who was killed during a bombing, the 1959 murder of Pearl Kongsle. This is a request I received several years ago from a listener named Ashley, and while I wasn't familiar with this story before, it turned out to be a major rabbit hole. This crime turned out to be the first time in the history of Seattle that a private citizen was intentionally assassinated with a booby trap, as an unknown individual left a paper sack containing an explosive device on the walkway outside Pearl's duplex, and when she bent over to pick it up, the bomb went off and killed her instantly. The whole thing left everyone completely perplexed, as Pearl was considered to be a kindly old widow who had just sold her share of the duplex the day before she was killed and was planning to relocate to New York. At the time, Pearl was involved in what appeared to be a bit of a love triangle with 2 different men, and one of them owned the other share of the duplex, but both these guys seemed to have airtight alibis and were ruled out as suspects. A trio of teenage boys were seen speeding away in a vehicle right after the blast went off, leading to speculation that Pearl's death was the result of some sort of prank gone horribly wrong, but even so, the bombing seemed a bit too sophisticated for that, and suggested that Pearl or someone else was intentionally targeted. What makes this story even stranger is that the family of Pearl's husband, who had passed away a full decade earlier, experienced their own bizarre series of events prior to the tragedy, as one of Pearl's nieces-in-law and her husband died after a mysterious poisoning, and some sticks of dynamite were discovered on the property of Pearl's brother-in-law only 3 weeks before the bombing. Under the circumstances, it seemed like too much of a coincidence that all these events could have taken place during such a short span of time, but no tangible connection could be found between them. There are a number of different theories about the bombing which killed Pearl, but no concrete evidence to support any of them, and we're definitely going to have a lot to talk about on today's episode. However, before we get started, just a quick reminder that The Trail Went Cold is a weekly podcast, which is currently available for download on several platforms, including Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, and more. So if you like this podcast, be sure to subscribe to it, and please leave us a rating or review on any of those sites to help spread the word and garner us more exposure. The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so if you would like to learn how to support the show, please visit our page at patreon.com/thetrailwentcold. For as little as $1 a month, you can garner access to exclusive rewards, including stickers and thank you cards, early access to episodes, and bonus content, as our Patreon page has over 80 exclusive bonus episodes in our archives, which are not available on our regular feed. So with all that out of the way, let us now explore the murder of Pearl Kongsle. Our story begins in Seattle, Washington in 1959, and our central figure is 62-year-old Pearl Agnes Kongsle. Pearl was born in Bellingham, but after being orphaned at a young age, she was raised by a relative in Stillwater, Minnesota. She eventually moved back to Washington State and settled at Edmonds, where she married her husband, Captain Guy Kongsle, who was a veteran master mariner on the Puget Sound and became the Deputy Commissioner of the United States Maritime Commission in Seattle. The couple never had any children, and Pearl became a widow when Guy passed away in December of 1949 at the age of 60. Following her husband's death, Pearl got a job selling silverware at a department store, but in 1951, she became involved with a longshoreman named Bill Myers, who was 18 years younger than her. The full nature of the relationship is unclear, but even though Pearl's friends didn't particularly like Bill, they decided to buy a house and move in together. In 1955, Pearl and Bill decided to sell the house and relocate to the West Seattle neighborhood, where they both purchased a newly constructed duplex at 7150 46th Place. But by the time 1959 rolled around, it sounds like Pearl and Bill's relationship had deteriorated, particularly after he suffered a heart attack in April, which rendered him unable to work. While Bill remained at home, Pearl still liked to go out dancing on her own, and she became involved with another man, 59-year-old Charlie Olson, who lived at a cheap hotel on a disabled veteran's pension and worked as a part-time clerk there. It's been reported that Pearl's friends liked Charlie a lot more than Bill, though it's unclear how serious their relationship was. Pearl eventually decided that she wanted to move, so on September the 1st, she officially sold her share of the duplex for $35,000 and was planning to travel to New York at the end of the month in order to live with relatives. As far as I can tell, the plan was for Bill to retain his share of the duplex and remain there, but on the very same day that Pearl made the sale, Bill started complaining about chest pains and checked himself into the Veterans Administration Hospital to seek treatment for a possible heart condition. The following evening, on September the 2nd, Pearl went out to dinner to a restaurant with a friend of hers named Alberta Bowman, who lived directly across the street from her duplex. After they finished dinner, Alberta advised Pearl to skip dessert because she was planning to bake some apple pies after she got home and would bring one over to her. After the two women left the restaurant, they returned to their respective residences at 6:30 p.m., and Alberta proceeded to spend the next 2 hours baking the pies. At around 8:15, Pearl had a 5-minute phone conversation with Charlie Olson before another friend of hers named Edith Friedman stopped by her house for a visit. Shortly before 8:45 p.m., Alberta left her own house with one of her freshly baked pies and walked across the street to Pearl's duplex. She climbed up a series of steps from the sidewalk onto a concrete walkway which passed through the front yard to the porch. Pearl soon came across a brown paper sack on the walkway located about 50 feet from the street, and it appeared to have a piece of cord or string protruding from the top. Alberta briefly bent down to pick up the sack, but felt that it was too heavy, and it appeared to be giving off vibrations and a sound which she later described as a quote-unquote gurgle or tick-tick-tick like a rattlesnake. Alberta ultimately decided to leave the sack there and walked up to the porch and rang the doorbell. Pearl answered the door, and after her and Edith came out onto the porch, Alberta told them about the sack and the walkway. Pearl walked over to check it and stared at the sack for about a minute before she bent down to pick it up. This prompted Edith to yell out, quote, "Pearl, don't touch it, it might be a bomb," but a split second later, right after Pearl touched the sack, it suddenly exploded. The blast proved to be so powerful that it wound up knocking Alberta and Edith off their feet onto the porch wall, and it shattered the windows of some nearby houses and knocked the hubcaps off a parked car. When the two women came to their senses, they noticed there was now a 1-foot crater in the walkway, and Pearl's charred body was now lying in the yard. Alberta crawled inside the house and used the phone to call the police and the fire department, who quickly showed up at the scene. Even though the explosion did not cause a fire, Pearl was killed instantly from the blast, and her duplex sustained considerable damage. Alberta and Edith both suffered flash burns and some minor injuries, but wound up pulling through after they were taken to the hospital for treatment. Pearl's right foot and part of her right hand were blown off during the explosion, and pieces of glass were found embedded in her body. She suffered a skull fracture, massive brain injuries, blunt force trauma injuries to her internal organs, and numerous contusions and lacerations. In fact, the blast proved so powerful that fragments of Pearl's clothing were found 150 feet away from the scene. Needless to say, the whole city was left stunned by the crime, as this marked the first time in the history of Seattle that a private citizen had been intentionally assassinated with a booby trap. A homicide investigation was launched by the Seattle Police Department, in which no less than 16 detectives were assigned to the case full-time. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover also offered his full support and assistance, informing the Seattle PD that agents and laboratory resources from the FBI would be at their disposal. It seemed obvious that the paper sack on the walkway had contained a bomb and a triggering device which was set to go off when Pearl touched it, but since these items were completely annihilated by the explosion, the authorities were unable to determine how the bomb was assembled. The Seattle PD enlisted the aid of some Army explosive experts from Fort Lawton, and while they were unable to identify the type of explosive used for the bomb, they were able to determine that it was not dynamite, TNT, or gunpowder. Since there were traces of what appeared to be nitrate residue on Pearl's clothing, it was theorized that the explosives were nitroglycerin, which was not available commercially, but could have been extracted from some sticks of dynamite. Since Pearl was described as being a kindly, well-liked woman, she did not seem to be a candidate for assassination, so investigators looked into the possibility that the bombing could have been a prank gone horribly wrong. The biggest lead they had to work with was an eyewitness account from a neighbor who claimed they saw 3 teenage boys climbing into a blue 4-door 1949 Chevrolet, which sped away without its lights on immediately after the blast took place. In the days following the bombing, police were contacted by a high school counselor who said that a male student had confided in him that he might have information about some other students who had a supply of dynamite in their possession and could have been responsible for the crime. Based on this tip, 6 young men between the ages of 17 and 19 were arrested for the theft of 13 boxes of dynamite from a powder storage warehouse, and one of these guys led police to a burned-out house on the outskirts of the city where most of this dynamite was being kept. The young men had their own supply of blasting caps and fuses and admitted to having set off some of the dynamite beneath an abandoned car and a tree. They had also discussed plans to set off the dynamite behind their school as a prank, but they all denied any involvement in the bombing which killed Pearl Kongsle, and no evidence could be found to link them to the crime. Investigators looked at the possibility that Bill Myers or Charlie Olson, the 2 most prominent men in Pearl's life, could have been responsible for the bombing. Charlie was quickly ruled out as a suspect, as he seemed to have an airtight alibi placing him at the hotel where he lived, which was located 8 miles away from the duplex. Charlie had spoken on the phone with Pearl from there only about 20 to 25 minutes before the bomb went off, and he also passed a polygraph. On the surface, Bill appeared to be a more likely suspect, since her relationship with Pearl seemed to be fractured, as she had sold her share of the duplex the day before she was killed and was planning to move to New York. Bill also owned a supply of gunpowder, which he used to make his own bullets in the duplex's basement, so investigators wondered if he had the capacity to assemble a bomb and conveniently checked himself into the Veterans Administration Hospital in order to fabricate an alibi for the night of the crime. However, the hospital confirmed that Bill was a frequent patient who often checked in there for medical reasons, and since his heart issues appeared to be legitimate, it did not seem like he was in any condition to assemble and plan a bomb on that particular night. Much like Charlie, Bill agreed to take a polygraph and passed, so he was pretty much ruled out as a suspect. Bill also told investigators that there had been recent issues with prowlers outside the duplex. In fact, he said that 1 week prior to the bombing, there was an incident where Pearl was woken up in the middle of the night after Bill's golden retriever Chief started barking, and she saw 2 young men running away from the residence. A few days later, Pearl told Bill that she was going to start carrying a gun, though she never provided any explanation why. Speaking of Bill's golden retriever Chief, the dog did not exactly have the best reputation, as he was known for constantly barking, which prompted the neighbors to complain. For this reason, investigators considered the possibility that Chief may have been the intended target of the bombing, as the dog was often kept outside the duplex on a chain, which would have been just long enough for him to reach the spot on the concrete walkway where the paper sack containing the bomb was left. But this theory was based on nothing more than pure speculation, and no evidence was found to support it. For their next lead, investigators looked into the family of Pearl's late husband, Guy Kongsle. Pearl had an estate worth $26,000, but 12 days before her death, she suddenly changed her will and decided to cut out everyone from Guy's side of the family. While details are murky, Pearl was apparently angry because one of Guy's brothers had left her nothing in his will when he passed away. At the time of Pearl's death, the beneficiaries of her estate were Charlie, Bill, a nephew of Bill's named Robert Richardson, and a longtime friend of hers named Flora Muffy. In the end, the authorities were inclined to believe that Pearl's changing of her will was nothing more than coincidental timing and played no role in her murder, but they were also intrigued by the fact that the Kongsle family had also recently experienced their fair share of bizarre and tragic incidents. At the time, Pearl's former brother-in-law, Elmer Kongsle, was living with his wife Joanna in Alderwood Manor, a rural section of Snohomish County located just outside Seattle. One of their daughters, Charlotte Kongsle Shutt, had recently gotten divorced from her own husband, Clyde Shutt, so Charlotte and their 3 children moved in with Elmer and Joanna. On the evening of August the 12th, 3 weeks before Pearl's murder, Charlotte had been entertaining guests at her parents' residence, but when her carpool group showed up there the following morning to drive her to work, they discovered 3 sticks of dynamite scattered around the front lawn. Charlotte contacted the Snohomish County Sheriff's Office, who soon arrived at the scene and collected the dynamite, though one of the sticks turned out to be broken. When the Sheriff's Office searched the property, they could not find any blasting caps, fuses, or anything that could have been used as a detonator, so it seemed apparent that the dynamite was never intended to go off. Well, Clyde Shutt worked as a supervisor at a Boeing aircraft plant, and in spite of their divorce, Charlotte was still employed there as well. When Charlotte showed up at work following the discovery of the dynamite, she was left unnerved when Clyde passed by her desk and suddenly remarked, quote, "See you had company last night. Did you have a good time?" This indicated to Charlotte that her ex-husband had been spying on her and possibly left the dynamite on her family's property, but when Clyde was questioned about this, he denied the allegations. Charlotte would later tell the press that she was left so frightened by the situation that she started sleeping with a loaded rifle in her bedroom. Of course, given that Pearl was killed after an explosive device was left on her property only 3 weeks later, investigators felt this seemed to be too much of a coincidence, so they looked for possible connections between the 2 incidents. While Clyde denied investigators' request to take a polygraph, he was not a particularly strong suspect in Pearl's murder, since as far as anyone could tell, he did not have any specialized knowledge about explosives or any apparent motive to harm her. In the end, no evidence could be found to link the bombing to the discovery of the dynamite on the Kongsle property, but it turned out that the family had experienced another strange and tragic mystery several months earlier. Elmer and Joanna's oldest daughter was 37-year-old Betty Jean Kongsle Baker, who had been married to Major Robert Douglas Baker, a 43-year-old World War II and Korean War veteran who was the senior unit advisor at the U.S. Army Reserve Center in Tacoma. The couple had 3 children and were stationed at Fort Lewis, but on the evening of April the 25th, 1959, Betty Jean woke up feeling very ill, so her husband took her to the Madigan Army Hospital. They concluded that Betty Jean likely had the flu and sent her back home, but after she became progressively more ill as the day went along, she was rushed to St. Joseph's Hospital. By this point, Robert had also become seriously ill, so a private car arrived at his residence to take him to the hospital, but while walking towards it, Robert suddenly collapsed on the front lawn and died. Only 3 hours later, Betty Jean also passed away while being treated at the hospital. Elmer and Joanna wound up gaining custody of the couple's 3 children, who were still living with them in Alderwood Manor when the incident with the dynamite took place in August. The entire family was left completely shocked and devastated by the loss of Betty Jean and Robert, as they had not experienced any noticeable health problems, and after autopsies were performed, the Pierce County coroner concluded that both victims had been fatally poisoned. At the outset, it was suspected that the cause of death was botulism, which was brought on by some olives and tequila the family had recently brought back from a vacation to Mexico. The bottle containing the olives had apparently been left open for several days before Betty Jean and Robert consumed them, and they also drank some tequila at dinner the night before they became ill. Since the couple's 3 children did not consume these items and never became ill, it did seem plausible that Betty Jean and Robert had suffered a fatal bout of food poisoning. However, when the Tacoma-Pierce County Health Department and the Food and Drug Administration performed an analysis on the olives, tequila, and all the other food items from the Baker household, they found nothing out of the ordinary to shed any light on why the couple was poisoned. Samples of the olives and the tequila were even fed to some lab animals, such as mice and chickens, but they did not become ill or experience any negative effects. Extensive testing was performed on the couple's stomach contents and their brain tissue at the Armed Forces Institute of Pathology at the Walter Reed Army Institute in Washington, D.C., as well as the Letterman Army Hospital in San Francisco. In the end, they were unable to determine the source of the poison in their systems or figure out what caused their deaths, though the Army stated that it could have been any one of 5,000 separate compounds. Ironically enough, when the Baker's death started receiving coverage in the local media, Pearl was one of the people who openly expressed her suspicions about the whole situation, as she told a Seattle Times reporter named Don Duncan, quote, "You should keep your eye on that case. I've got my suspicions that there is more to it than meets the eye," end quote. The whole thing remained a perplexing mystery, but nothing could be found to suggest that the Baker's deaths were connected to the discovery of the dynamite on Elmer Kongsle's property or the bombing that killed Pearl. Charlotte brought up the possibility of her ex-husband Clyde murdering her sister and brother-in-law as revenge for their divorce, but there was nothing in Clyde's background to indicate that he had any specialized knowledge of poisons or chemistry. These cases eventually faded from the spotlight, but in 2015, an explosives expert from the Bureau of Alcohol, Tobacco, and Firearms decided to perform their own review on the bombing which killed Pearl. Based on the information from the original case documents and crime scene photographs, they concluded that the bomb was likely a quote-unquote victim-operated, electric-initiated bomb made from dynamite. This meant that when Pearl attempted to pick up the device, she likely initiated a mercury switch, which caused the detonation. Around the same time period, a veteran Seattle homicide detective named Mike Szynski decided to take a fresh look at the case, but failed to turn up any leads. While the Seattle Police Department still considers the murder of Pearl Kongsle to be an open investigation, the crime continues to remain unsolved. So I guess you could say the trail went cold. So this is definitely one of the more unusual crimes I've ever featured on The Trail Went Cold, as leaving a booby-trap bomb outside a victim's residence is not the most common method to murder someone. The only other case I've covered involving something like this was the Blount family bombing, which took place in Texas in 1985 and was the subject of episode number 202 of the podcast. And much like the murder of Pearl Kongsle, no one can figure out a logical motive for why anyone wanted these particular victims dead, so theories were pushed forward about the Blount family bombing possibly being a completely random crime, a prank gone wrong, or a case of mistaken identity. Since the Blounts lived in a mobile home park, perhaps someone just left the bomb on the doorstep of the wrong trailer, and they were completely innocent victims who were simply in the wrong place at the wrong time. The murder of Pearl Kongsle is even more perplexing, because she was a 62-year-old widow who was described as being a very kind individual and did not appear to have any serious enemies. While there were a few people from her personal life who could have had a motive to harm her, they were all pretty much ruled out, and none of them appeared to have the necessary skills to construct a device like this. Since the explosion eradicated most of the evidence, investigators were unable to determine the exact type of bomb this was, but we are talking about 1959 forensics, and if this crime had taken place today, they might have been able to figure it out. Indeed, like I just mentioned, when an explosive expert performed an analysis in 2015, they concluded that the device likely consisted of dynamite that would have been initiated by a mercury switch, even though the experts back in 1959 believed the bomb was not made up of dynamite, but rather nitroglycerin, which was extracted from some dynamite. Whatever the case, based on this analysis, it does seem like the bomb was put together with someone who was knowledgeable about explosives rather than just a bunch of teenagers who were attempting a dumb prank, but this begs the question of why someone like Pearl Kongsle would be targeted. So when the bombing originally took place, it got nationwide media coverage, and I can't fault law enforcement for how they handled this, as they conducted a very extensive investigation in which J. Edgar Hoover himself offered his assistance. But none of the leads they followed went anywhere, and looking back through the newspaper archives, it appears that the media coverage completely dried up after 1961, until veteran homicide detective Mike Szynski decided to take a fresh look at the case 5 decades later. Szynski has since retired and said that he was unable to turn up a single new lead when he relaunched the investigation, which I guess isn't too surprising, considering that the majority of people connected to this case are likely now deceased. However, the crime is definitely a major head-scratcher, and it's all the more bizarre when you factor in all the strange incidents which occurred in the months prior to the bombing and involved the family of Pearl's late husband, as we have no idea if these are even connected to the case. Now, on the one hand, leaving a booby-trap bomb outside the residence of your intended victim is an effective method to murder someone, since it allows you to successfully commit the crime when you're not even at the scene. But on the other hand, you can't guarantee that the murder will be carried out as intended. Case in point, we have Pearl's friend, Alberta Bowman, who discovered the paper sack containing the bomb on the walkway outside Pearl's residence a few minutes before Pearl grabbed it. It seems unlikely that the bomb was on a timer, as it was probably rigged to go off the moment someone moved it or picked it up, but Alberta briefly attempted to grab the sack herself and only decided against it because it was too heavy. If Alberta had caused the bomb to go off, then she would have been killed while Pearl was inside the house, so if Pearl was the intended target, then that means the perpetrator's original plan backfired. Pearl originally arrived home at 6:30 p.m., over 2 hours before the bomb went off, and I'm guessing the sack was not outside on the walkway at that point. Pearl's other friend, Edith Friedman, showed up at the duplex at around 8:30, and since she didn't report seeing the sack on the walkway, it probably still wasn't there yet until Alberta crossed the street and walked up to the front door at 8:45. But what if Alberta and Edith never went to the duplex that night? Would the bomb have just remained outside until morning, or the next time Pearl left? But of course, it's possible that this was a completely random crime, and the person who assembled and rigged this device didn't care who picked it up because they just wanted to kill someone, no matter who it was. Or it could have been someone who only intended to set the thing off as a prank, but didn't expect to kill anyone. At the outset, the only major lead was the sighting of 3 teenage boys climbing into a blue 1949 Chevrolet, which sped away from the scene right after the bomb went off. Try as they might, investigators just could not track down or identify the boys or the vehicle, and for all we know, it's possible they had nothing to do with what happened. I'm sure that must have seemed like a promising lead when a group of 6 young men were soon arrested for having recently stolen 13 boxes of dynamite from a powder storage warehouse, as that's yet another odd coincidence in a case that seems to have a lot of them. It sounds like these guys had already set off some of the sticks of dynamite for fun at other locations, but while no specifics were provided, I get the impression that this probably involved nothing more sophisticated than lighting the fuse, running away, and ducking for cover after the dynamite went off. That's a far cry from turning some sticks of dynamite into a bomb and rigging it to go off when someone touches it, and I'm not sure if any of these guys would have had the knowledge or expertise to do something like that. I mean, this didn't just cause a minor explosion, it created a blast of such force that it shattered the windows of nearby houses. Of course, these days, kids can look up information about how to build a bomb on the internet, but back in 1959, that information was much more difficult to come by. These young men did not sound like sophisticated criminals, and given that this angle ultimately went nowhere, I'm guessing that none of them could be linked to a blue 1949 Chevrolet. It's also possible that the 3 boys seen climbing into the Chevy were a completely different set of boys than the group who stole the dynamite, but even if they were responsible for the bombing, what was their plan, and why did they choose that particular location? It would be one thing if someone rang Pearl's doorbell and ran away in order to lure her outside to discover the paper sack, but if Alberta had not paid a visit there that night and came across the sack on the walkway, it's possible that Pearl wouldn't have seen it at all until morning, and would the boys in the Chevy really have hung around that long to make sure the bomb went off? While I'm undecided about whether this was a random crime or Pearl was intentionally targeted, I am fairly certain that this was not just intended as a harmless prank, and the perpetrator or perpetrators had malicious intent and were hoping to seriously injure someone. So it definitely seems like convenient timing that this bombing would take place the very day after Pearl sold her share of the duplex for $35,000. It's never been revealed who exactly she sold it to, but I wager they were none too thrilled to have paid that much money for a residence that wound up sustaining around $5,000 worth of damage from the explosion. And of course, and yet another odd coincidence, the guy who owned the other half of the duplex, Bill Myers, just happened to be checked into a hospital on the night the bomb went off. The details of Pearl and Bill's relationship status are pretty murky, but we know that in the years following the death of Pearl's husband, they decided to purchase a house together before they purchased the duplex in 1955. It's really not clear to me how romantically involved they were, but I have to assume that whatever spark they might have had was long gone by 1959, since Pearl was now seeing Charlie Olson and moving out of the duplex. According to Pearl's friends, Charlie was a much nicer person than Bill, but I'm not sure if that relationship had many long-term prospects either, since Pearl was planning to relocate to the opposite side of the country and live in New York. This decision could have given both Bill and Charlie a possible motive to harm Pearl, but it sounds like they both had very solid alibis on the night of the bombing. Charlie could be placed at a hotel 8 miles away and spoke to Pearl on the phone from there about 15 minutes before the bomb went off, whereas Bill was laid up in the hospital seeking treatment for heart issues, and it sounds like he was not in the best of shape. This doesn't rule out the possibility of either of these men arranging for someone else to plant the bomb outside the duplex, but no evidence was ever found to support this scenario, and it doesn't sound like Bill or Charlie had much expertise with explosives. However, what about the possibility that instead of Pearl being the intended target, it was actually Bill's golden retriever, Chief? Now, I know it's a fact that some true crime fans are infinitely more sensitive about animals being murdered than people, so if the perpetrator's entire motive was to blow up a dog, then I'm sure these people must feel that this truly elevates this person to the level of irredeemable monster. But since Chief was apparently a rather unfriendly animal who often barked very loudly, could someone have reached their breaking point and decided to assemble an explosive device to deal with the problem? It's been reported that Chief's chain was just long enough that if the dog saw the paper sack on the walkway and decided to go after it, he would have been able to reach and possibly move the device and cause it to go off. Obviously, if the perpetrator left the bomb at a spot that was closer to Chief, then the dog may have started barking and alerted the neighborhood to their presence. If Pearl was the target, it does seem odd that the perpetrator would have left the bomb on the walkway rather than on the porch near the front door, but placing it at that spot at night, when you know Chief is going to be outdoors, does make sense if he was the target. While you can question whether or not Bill is a reliable witness, he was the one who told the authorities that in the month prior to Pearl's murder, they had been dealing with prowlers outside their duplex, including one incident where Pearl was awakened by Chief's barking and they saw 2 young men running away. According to Bill, Pearl had told her that she was going to start carrying a gun, but it's unclear if she had one on the night she was killed, and it doesn't sound like she was carrying the gun when she went outside to check the paper sack. And we also don't know if Pearl wanted to have a gun because she kept dealing with random prowlers, or if she was afraid that a specific person might harm her. Alberta and Edith said that Pearl stared down at the sack on the walkway for about a minute before she tried to pick it up, so I'd be curious to know what was going on inside her head during those final moments, and if she suspected anyone of leaving that there. But part of me wonders if these prowlers were targeting Chief and realized that it would have been difficult to get close to the dog without him barking, which is why they came up with the idea of leaving a bomb in the yard for him to find. So another piece of coincidental timing is that only 12 days before she was killed, Pearl decided to revise her will by cutting out her late husband's relatives, and at the time of her death, the 4 beneficiaries of her estate were Bill, Charles, Bill's nephew, and another friend of hers named Flora Muffy. I'm sure that could have provided these 4 people with a potential motive to want Pearl dead, but I'm not even sure if any of them were aware that they had become beneficiaries, and investigators found no evidence to suggest that any of these people were involved in the bombing. Since Guy Kongsle passed away a full decade earlier, I'm not sure if Pearl still had a close relationship with his side of the family, but a revision of the will makes it sound like she had become completely estranged from them. And for this reason, it's hard to figure out if the strange events which befell that family had any connection to what happened to Pearl. Now, obviously, the timing of the incident with the dynamite is pretty troubling, but before we talk about that, let's discuss the odd deaths of Robert and Betty Jean Baker, which took place on April the 25th, 1959, just over 4 months before Pearl was killed. The original explanation about Robert and Betty Jean suffering a fatal case of botulism after consuming some contaminated olives and tequila from Mexico sounds like a perfectly logical theory, particularly since their 3 children never consumed these items or suffered any ill effects at all. However, it sounds like the authorities went all out with testing these items and did not believe they would have caused any fatal poisoning, so in the end, they were unable to figure out what exactly killed them. They never specifically stated that the Bakers were intentionally poisoned or were the victims of foul play, but I'm not sure they could rule it out either. If this was murder, the responsible party must have used a poison that was very difficult to trace and ensured that only Robert and Betty Jean would ingest it and not their children. I have to add the disclaimer that we're talking about 1959 forensic science, which is nowhere near as sophisticated as it is today, so if the Bakers died under these circumstances in recent years, it's possible that testing would have been able to determine what killed them, and maybe they would have concluded that it was the result of simple food poisoning all along. The issue with believing this was foul play is that we know so little about Robert and Betty Jean's background, so I'm not sure who would have had a motive to murder them. As we're going to talk about momentarily, Betty Jean's sister Charlotte was going through a contentious divorce with her estranged ex-husband Clyde Shutt during this time period. If Clyde was outraged enough, I suppose he could have been motivated to kill his former sister and brother-in-law, but it doesn't sound like Clyde had any background in chemistry and would have possessed the scientific knowledge to murder 2 people with an untraceable poison. And putting that aside, I really don't see anything to indicate that the deaths of the Bakers have any connection to what happened to Pearl, as poisoning and bombing are 2 vastly different methods of homicide. The timing is probably nothing more than a coincidence, but regardless, what happened to the Bakers is still a pretty intriguing unsolved mystery in its own right, and I thought it was worth discussing here, though I'm not sure it will ever truly be solved. However, I can't discount the possibility of a connection between Pearl's death and the discovery of 3 sticks of dynamite on the property of her former brother and sister-in-law, Elmer and Joanna Kongsle, since that incident took place only 3 weeks beforehand, and it seems likely that dynamite was used to construct the bomb which killed Pearl. The key difference is that I don't believe the dynamite found on the Kongsle's property was ever intended to go off or harm anyone, since there were no blasting caps or fuses, and one of the sticks was broken. It may have just been left there for the purpose of intimidating someone, which is why the most logical suspect is Clyde Shutt, as Charlotte and their children were living with Elmer and Joanna at that time. Since Clyde mentioned Charlotte having company there the night before the dynamite was found, she believed that he may have been spying on her and used this opportunity to leave the dynamite. While this was never conclusively proven, that does sound like the most logical explanation to me, as this whole incident may be nothing more than an immature man playing games to try and intimidate his ex-wife. But would Clyde have taken things even further and constructed a bomb to kill Pearl? Well, putting aside the fact that Clyde did not appear to have any specialized skills with explosives or bomb making, I'm not sure what motive he would have had. Even if Clyde was bitter about the divorce, I don't know if Charlotte and Pearl even had a close relationship, especially since Pearl's husband died a full decade earlier. If Clyde wanted to get revenge on Charlotte by harming one of her relatives, it seems far more likely that he would set off a bomb on the property of her mother and father, rather than an aunt by marriage whom she may not have spoken to for years. While the timing of the 2 incidents still seems like a troubling coincidence, you have to remember that this case was the subject of a very extensive investigation, and they never found any evidence to suggest that Clyde or anyone else from the Kongsle family were involved in the bombing. Given the circumstances, it's possible that the most logical theory in this case is that Pearl was not specifically targeted. She could have been the victim of mistaken identity, as the bomber may have been planning on killing someone else, but left the paper sack containing the explosive device at the wrong address, which has always been pushed forward as a theory in the Blount family bombing. If the crime was completely random and there was no personal connection between Pearl and the perpetrator, that could explain why all the potential leads in this case turned out to be dead ends. I also made mention of the theory that Bill Myers' dog, Champ, was the intended target, and as silly as that theory might sound, it would account for the odd nature of this crime. If those 3 teenage boys seen climbing into the blue Chevy were responsible for leaving the bomb on the walkway, they may have only been intending to harm the dog in some sort of mean-spirited prank, but were taken by complete surprise when Pearl emerged from the house and touched the device. And since they weren't planning to kill a human being, the 3 boys hightailed it away from the house as quickly as possible and managed to keep their mouths shut about what they did. Alternatively, perhaps there was no rhyme or reason to this crime, and the perpetrator was just a mad bomber who chose Pearl's property completely at random because they wanted to blow someone up and didn't care who it was. Whatever their motive, it seems like the responsible party essentially got away with the perfect crime. Even though there have been no major leads in several decades, the investigation is still considered to be open, and while the chances of solving it after all this time are minuscule, it's always worth keeping these cold cases in the spotlight and ensuring the victim is never forgotten. So if you happen to have any information about the murder of Pearl Kongsle, please contact the Seattle Police Department. But if you just have your own thoughts about what happened, feel free to leave me a comment or send me an email to robin.warder@icloud.com. That's robin.warder@icloud.com. Now the reminder that The Trail Went Cold is on Patreon, so please visit patreon.com/thetrailwentcold to learn how you can support our podcast and become eligible for some pretty neat rewards. Over the past 7 years, our Patreon page has released over 80 exclusive bonus episodes, which are all currently available in archives for our patrons in tiers 2 and 3. This past month, I released a bonus episode about the unsolved disappearances of Jack Quinn and Philip Breen, a pair of fugitives profiled on Unsolved Mysteries who were wanted for committing financial crimes, but were never caught and are still fugitives to this day. I've also dropped an exclusive bonus episode from my spin-off podcast, The Path Went Chilly, in which myself and one of my co-hosts, Jules, discuss the 1976 murders of James Fround and Pamela Buckley, who used to be a pair of unidentified decedents known only as the Sumter County Does. And for our patrons in Tier 3, I've also recorded another new audio commentary track, which can be played over a classic episode of Unsolved Mysteries, and we now have over 70 of these commentary tracks in our archives. I also wanted to mention that in just 1 month, The Trail Went Cold will be appearing on Podcast Row at the True Crime Podcast Festival, which is taking place in Boston, Massachusetts at the Doubletree by Hilton Hotel, Boston North Shore from July the 18th to the 20th. If you would like to purchase tickets, we have a specialized promo code you can use to get a 20% discount on them. So please visit truecrimepodcastfestival.com and use the promo code ROBIN20 to get 20% off tickets. Once again, visit True Crime Podcast Festival, and the promo code is ROBIN20 for 20% off. I just wanted to give another shout out to my supporters at the Unsolved Mysteries message board at the Sitcoms Online forum and the Unresolved Mysteries subreddit. I need to provide a big thanks to Miguel Foote, who edits and assembles this podcast together for me, and Vince Nitro, who composes the eerie music you hear on every episode. If you haven't already, you can like us on Facebook, follow us on Twitter and Instagram, or leave us a rating or review on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, Amazon Music, YouTube Music, Podcast Addict, or whatever your favorite podcasting platform is. So have yourselves a great week and join us next Wednesday for our next brand new episode of The Trail Went Cold.